Hi, I'm Rick Anthony, and welcome to the Someone You Should Know podcast, the podcast that focuses on musicians, authors, and interesting people. We like to say we're making a difference one artist at a time. So sit back, have a cold one, and get ready to meet someone you should know. I have a very interesting guest on today's Someone You Should Know podcast. He's a musician from New York, a singer, a songwriter, an activist, a music producer, and a record label owner. And you're going to love his music. He is Blake Morgan. Blake, welcome aboard.
Thanks so much for having me.
Blake, your music was actually pitched to me by my wife, Leslie. She loves trolling all over the social media and finding great artists for me to investigate. She fell in love with your music immediately and says, you've got to get this guy on your show. So I reached out to you. I want to find out, first off, tell us about Engine Company Record Music Group that was founded in 2002.
Right. It's great to be here, and big thanks to your wife for being such a fan. That's we love that. Yeah, so ECR Music Group, the label that I founded, it used to be called Engine Company Records, and then in 2012 we rebranded because we'd grown a sizable amount, really to become a global music company. But originally, the label began. I founded it on my laptop on a Wednesday, and
it's amazing what we can do nowadays, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I, people always talk about necessity being the mother of invention. Well, sometimes desperation is too. And I had just fought my way out of my major label deal, and I'd had great experience on the one hand, artistically, and a very bad experience on the other hand, professionally. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And I was actually walking down the street with my mother, and I said, God, instead of me showcasing for other deals, and instead of me going through all of this again, if I had any guts, I would start my own label. And she said, yeah, you know what? If you had any guts, you would. And she wasn't having at me. She was just kind of challenging me to do what I was sort of toying around with doing. And that's what I did. And I launched it on my laptop. And all of these years later, we've grown to become a major indie record label distributed through The Orchard and Sony. We have a roster of artists on our label. We have a roster of imprints on our label, smaller labels that we parent. In fact, we're just about to start. I haven't really even talked about this, so this is kind of one of the first times I'm talking about it publicly. But we're starting our music publishing business this year as well. Also in partnership with Sony. So ECR Music Publishing is now going to be a big part of this label, and protecting and shepherding the composition side of what our artists do alongside with the recording that they do. So
wonderful. We've
grown to become a really, it's a beautiful part of my musical life, and really the ethos of the label. It's born out of my recording studio. As a producer and record maker, I just didn't want to hand the music that I was making, that I believe in so much, over to someone else who then invariably may kind of screw it up. Right. So the label is an extension of the music that I make, and all of the artists on the label, all of their new records are records that I've produced or mixed or mastered. So it's a holistic, and it's become a really beautiful and powerful way for us to fight for and to win audiences for the music that we make and love.
I love it. I love that idea. And God bless your mom for challenging you.
Yes, it's a good story. I love that story.
Let's talk a couple about the artists that you've got on. Can you name a couple and any projects that are coming out soon that we should know about?
It's been a great couple years here. My new record came out. I'm an artist on the label as well as the president and founder of the label. So I'm playing by the same rules, but my record just came out, and David Poe, celebrated and beautiful songwriter and great friend and recording artist, his new record, Everyone's Got a Camera, is also just out. We're in the studio right now working on what will be the new record out next year for Yanata, who is one of our franchise artists as well. Black Emoji is it's the moniker of Kelsey Warren, who is a recording artist and producer here in New York City. He's just come aboard the label, and we're in the midst of this year remastering a series of deluxe edition reissues for his catalog. His new deluxe edition of his album Eclectro just came out, and there will be a similar deluxe edition for his album Antidote that comes out in the fall. So that's just a few of the artists that we have on the label. I'm also in the studio right now making a new record with Chris Barron, lead singer of Spin Doctors. So that's going to be out in the not too distant future as well. So, there's a relationship between what we work on here in the studio and what's coming out, and building that bridge to those audiences that I mentioned.
Wonderful. What I'll do is down in the show notes, I will link to the label. And that way, anyone who's interested in those particular artists can find a little bit more by going down there. That'll be down in the show notes that we'll talk about a little bit later in the show. When did you first fall in love with music? Was it elementary school, middle school? Was it the Beatles? What actually prompted you to actually fall in love with music?
You mentioned the Beatles, and they are elemental to my musical makeup, no doubt. But yes, it really wasn't that I found music. Music found me. I was 4 and 5 years old, already going to music school and playing piano, and kind of really on a path to, I think initially, to kind of really be a serious, what people would call classical, but a serious pianist. Mm-hmm. And then it was very clear to me early on that I was much more interested in what I was writing than what I was playing. So I then knew I was going to be a music maker and not just a music performer. And actually, it really was the Beatles that blew my mind. And I can still remember the sense memory of me first hearing "She Loves You." And this is another story about my mother. In fact, both my parents are artists and writers, and they had all of their Beatle records in chronological order on the shelf, and I picked up the first one, the American version, which is Meet the Beatles. And and I remember this is the one with the 4 of them in black turtlenecks, floating heads, and I remember pointing to one of them. I was 5 years old, and I said, I know this one is Ringo, but what are the other names? And my mother turned around and was like, "You sit down. No son of mine is going to be walking around New York City not being able to name all 4 of the Beatles." But I remember hearing the beginning of "She Loves You" and that tom roll into the vocal thing, and just like my entire universe exploding, and it's really kind of never stopped exploding. So music found me first, but then the moment I connected with the Beatles in that way, it's really just kind of never stopped.
Kudos again to Mama Morgan.
Yeah, no, it's the back-to-back stories, but they're both true.
Tell your mom I'm a big fan of her. After high school, you attended the prestigious Berklee College of Music. And get this, gang, he did a 4-year degree. He didn't do it in 4 years. He did it in 3 and graduated magna cum laude. Talk about an overachiever.
Well, I don't know how you know that, but that is true. And the real question is, how did I do that while simultaneously opening a bar in my dorm room and later on opening a poker game in my dorm room?
So you had a speakeasy.
I spent most of college. Yes, exactly. It was a speakeasy and gambling establishment, which sets up perfectly, Rick, my being a label mogul later on in my career. But the miracle to me is how I did that. While eating ice cream and playing poker a lot in college. But I made some great friends there who I'm still in touch with. And in all seriousness, the Berklee experience for me was a really important one. Not even so much because of this thing or that thing, but mostly because it was a period of my life where I could plug holes in my musical understanding and really be exposed to and listen to music I was not listening to, and just get a basic understanding past the music that was moving me and informing what I was really excited about, but learning about artists who I hadn't been listening to, and plugging some just basic musical holes in my musical knowledge from a technical standpoint, and then also from an artistic standpoint, And so that I think that at least when in the time that I was there, I think that was that's the most valuable part of my experience.
Awesome. Very good. Now, we mentioned the fact that you've got a brand new album out, but prior to that, you had a couple of previous releases. You had Anger's Candy in 97, you had Burning Daylight in 2005, Silencer in 2006, and Diamonds in the Dark in 2013. Your most recent project is called Violent Delights, came out last year. And we're going to feature a couple songs from that. The first song we're going to showcase is the one that my wife Leslie introduced to me a real catchy tune that I really like called My Love Is Waiting. Can you give us the backstory on it?
Yes, I think this was actually the first song I finished writing for this new record, and it really set the tone for the entire album, which is an album of, not entirely, but mostly of pretty uplifting love songs. And I'd never done that before. If you go, people who know my work, going back through my catalog, there are breakup songs, but there are not a whole lot of, wow, I'm really in love with this person kind of song. And this record has several of those, which also inspires the title of the record, which I can tell you about later. But My Love Is Waiting was the first song I really finished writing for this record, and I think it really set the tone for the entire thing.
All right. From the album Violent Delights, here is My Love Is Waiting from today's guest, Blake Morgan, on the Someone You Should Know podcast. Great song right there from the album Violent Delights. The song is My Love Is Waiting from today's guest, Blake Morgan. You're going to be humming that one all day long. Before we continue, I want to thank you for listening in to the Someone You Should Know podcast. I invite you to check us out at our website, SomeoneYouShouldKnowPodcast.com. There you're going to find the recent news, our archive of past episodes, and a whole lot more. By the way, if you are enjoying it, I invite you to leave a review and let us know how we're doing. It always helps us out. And I want to thank everybody because we're very, very blessed because because we're getting listeners all around the world. Today, we'd like to salute Nuevo Leon, Mexico, and Schenectady, New York. Thank you so much for listening. And now back to our interview with Blake Morgan. And one of the things I really love about this guy is he stands up for the rights of artists. He's an activist involved with supporting musicians so they get paid to play. And how did this all get started, Blake? And where are we now with the whole process?
Well, thanks. Thanks for giving me a chance to talk about that. I'm an accidental music rights activist, but a proud one, and I'm shouldering the mantle as well as I can. How this began was again not planned. An email exchange between me and the then president and founder of Pandora, internet radio giant Pandora, was made public in the Huffington Post, where I was calling that president out on the company's royalty structure payments to artists, and also I was calling him out on lobbying Congress to lower our artist royalty rates by up to 85%. And this was, a celebrated moment for people in independent music, because at that time I think it had been there were few and far between instances where artists were standing up to the corporate interests in music and actually making any headway. And the wave that followed after that email exchange was made public forced Pandora to withdraw their legislation. So it was a real victory. And out of that, I then began writing op-eds, and an op-ed of mine in the Huffington Post gave birth to my I Respect Music campaign. And the I Respect Music campaign also really moved the needle and has put me on Capitol Hill many, many times, meeting with congressional leaders about the issues facing artists. At the top of the list for me since the beginning has been, and I'm talking to a radio professional here, but one of the oldest issue facing artists is that many people still don't know that artists do not get paid for radio airplay in the United States of America. In fact, the U.S. is the only country, the only democratic country in the world where that's the case. Only China and North Korea share that distinction. And what does that mean? It means, I Respect Music is somewhat of an homage to Aretha Franklin. And what I'm saying is what it means is that Aretha Franklin never was paid one dime for Respect being on the radio in the United States, because she didn't write the song. Otis Redding wrote the song. Songwriters get paid for radio airplay, as they should. I'm a songwriter. We don't get paid as much as we should, but we do get paid something. The person who is singing the song, the performer, the recording artist, doesn't get paid anything. And so that's what we're trying to change. And now we have a piece of legislation that's just been reintroduced in the United States Senate and over in the House, called the American Music Fairness Act, which for the first time in American history would close this loophole that big corporate radio squeezes through in not paying us fairly.
No.
And there's another issue here as well, which is that because in the United States artists don't get paid anything for AM/FM radio airplay, it also means we're not paying international artists here, and because of that, the rest of the democratic world is no longer paying U.S. artists there. So it's sort of like a de facto embargo. It's like the UK is saying, well, if you're not going to pay Adele, a UK artist in the United States, then we're not going to pay Kanye in the UK, right, who's an American artist. So there's this de facto global trade embargo against the United States, music world. That would bring an enormous amount of revenue back to our economy, by the way. Not back, we've never had it. It would bring an enormous amount of revenue to our economy. It would help pay artists, and it would help pay artists around the world as well. The most significant thing is that this kind of legislation, this is not for big rock stars. I'm throwing around names like Adele, but the reality is it's people like me, middle-class artists, who are hurt the most. As the middle class is often hurt the most in our economy when things when pieces of our economy are not set up with some basic fairness. So it's middle class artists like myself who that revenue would really, really, really make a difference to. So this isn't just about superstars. In fact, it's quite the opposite. That extra money allows me to hire band members. It allows me to hire people who would work in the recording studio. It would move around our economy the way it's supposed to, instead of it simply being a wall that we can't seem to climb over.
Wow.
So I'm hoping that the American Music Fairness Act is going to be able to change that, and it's exciting to be able to fight for it.
As that progresses, we might need to have you back on, Blake, to kind of give us an update on how that is progressing and such. It's funny, last fall I was talking to a dear friend of mine, Soup Granda of the Ozark Mountain Daredevils, and he said, wow, every month or so he gets a royalty check and goes, oh, wow, my song got 20,000 plays, and here's my check for $2.
Right.
That is just sad. That is just really sad.
Yeah, exactly. And in a world now where streaming is really dominating the music industry, our micro penny payments over at Spotify and the other streaming giants, this is a whole new area that we have to unite together against in getting fair compensation. Artists are always the canary in the coal mine, with new technology, and there's this sort of tropish argument that comes up against us, which is like, well, you can't be against progress. Musicians are not against progress. Musicians are technologically savvy as anyone else. I mean, we embrace technology all the time. This isn't a question of technology. It's a question of paying people fairly for their work.
I totally agree
that,
with you.
Of course, has been a human struggle throughout history. I'm a music maker who doesn't think that what I do is any more or less important than what everybody else does.
Well,
I do think that bus drivers should be paid fairly for their work. I think that teachers should be paid fairly for their work, and firefighters. I think that plumbers should be paid fairly for their work, and I think musicians should be too.
I agree with you. I think everybody. I think it's a misnomer that the average listener right now didn't realize that the person who's singing the song isn't getting a dime from airplay. And it's just going to the writer. Now, I happen to know that because my late wife and I used to manage bands, and we used to know exactly how much our boys and girls were making, and it wasn't much. But this show right here is geared to help artists get the word out about music and themselves. Corporate radio has just made it so incredibly difficult for anyone to make a living in the music business anymore. We're going to feature another song that deserves some airplay, another song from Violent Delights. This song is called Down Below and Up Above. Can you give us a little synopsis on this one, Blake?
Yeah, this the melody for this song I had knocking around my head for years, and I couldn't. I was so committed to it and so committed to the song itself. I couldn't marry it with the right lyrics, and I couldn't finish it off. I mean, it was really, I had this song really kind of on the burner cooking, really back when I made Diamonds in the Dark. And then finally I was able to figure out just exactly the right thing I wanted that melody to express, and very quickly then the song came together. So it's an interesting songwriter moment for me, because it's sort of like I wrote the music and then brought it across the room to my lyricist, who also happens to be me, who was finally able to finish it off. And it's a tone setter for the record in a different way. It's the first track on the record, not the first one I wrote, but kind of it, because I've been working on it for years. So it's the first track on the record, and I think it really kind of sets the tone, not only from a song standpoint, but from how it sounds. As a record maker, how records sound really matters to me. And there's a post-punk influence on this record. There's an almost early 80s influence of bands that I love, like the Police and the Cars, and I think you can hear echoes of that in this track.
All right, we're going to play that song right now. Down Below and Up Above from the album Violent Delights from today's guest, Blake Morgan.
Break and run.
Down Below and Up Above, music from the album Violent Delights from today's guest, Blake Morgan. Blake, let's give some kudos to the folks that were performing on this album. Who helped you out with this particular album?
Yeah, so an interesting story. I'm actually playing all of the instruments on the record except for drum kit.
Didn't I say overachiever? Didn't I say overachiever?
So my friend and great drummer Miles East is playing drums on the record. Mm-hmm. We've made many records together, and not only just under my name, but for many other artists. And in fact, Miles is a beautiful songwriter and singer himself, and we've just finished his new record, which is going to be out next year as well. So he's playing drums, but other than that, every other sound that you hear on the record is something that I have that I played.
Wow. Part of getting the word out about music is years and years of touring. This next section is called Tales from the Road. These are those infamous road stories of where things didn't go necessarily as planned. You get to a gig and you plug in and the fuse blows, or you get to a gig and realize that the establishment no longer exists. Blake, what would you say your Tales from the Road might be?
Well, we'd need 2 hours just for this segment. Over the last 6 years, sandwiched around the pandemic and even a little through the pandemic, I've put 175,000 miles of touring. I've done 175,000 miles of touring, and over 200 performances in the U.S. and across the Atlantic in the UK and Europe. So it's been a lot of touring, and at a time in my life when I wasn't really sure that that's what I was going to be doing. And at the same time, I've had an ongoing residency here in New York City at Rockwood Music Hall. And I've just completed a run of 30 sold-out shows at Rockwood Music Hall. Nice. So I'm taking a little bit of a break from touring and performing right now. But I'll tell you this. I'll take your premise of instead of telling you a touring horror story, which would just make your listeners clutch their pearls, I'll tell you something else that's special and emotional.
All right, lay it on me.
The thing about Rockwood Music Hall is they have 3 stages, and beautiful stage 3 is this beautiful listening room down a flight of stairs, and that's where I've been doing this residency for 7 years, and again having sold out that run of shows, which I'm very proud of. It means the world to me because it's on the Lower East Side here in Manhattan. I grew up on the Lower East Side in Manhattan, and my father and I used to go to Fat Tuesdays, which was just up the street on 3rd Avenue where I grew up. And that's where Les Paul used to play. Les Paul, the Les Paul guitar, and also credited at minimum influencing, if not inventing, multi-track recording and much technology, once again, that music makers use all the time. But Les Paul would perform in this little room that held about 60 or 70 people every Monday night at Fat Tuesdays. And my father and I would go, and I was a kid, and we would order a hamburger and sit there and listen to Les Paul play with his trio. And I remember thinking how cool this is. Like, wow, playing at Madison Square Garden has got to be really cool also. But the idea that you could just go down a flight of stairs and be in a different world where a great musician would be able to captivate a small room of 60, 75, 80 people, something like that, for that period of time, so that you felt something, not only individually, but as a group with all the other people who were there. And then afterwards, you'd climb a flight of stairs and be back out into the world, like you were back in Kansas after having been in Oz. And we would go and see those shows, and they were so important and so moving to me that when I started my residency at Rockwood, well, guess what? Stage 3 is down a flight of stairs in this beautiful listening room with velvet on the walls and a grand piano, and I performed those shows solo for the most part. And I would tell my audience this many times over the course of that run, that if you asked me, would you rather play at Radio City Music Hall or Rockwood Music Hall? As crazy as this sounds, I swear to you, I'd have to think about it for a second, because that's how it's so ingrained in me. The small listening room where you can see the whites of people's eyes. And I've played on small stages. I've played on huge stages. I've played to big crowds. I've played to no crowds. I've done it all, right? But I have to tell you that repeated experience of playing to a beautiful audience that's captivated, where there's nowhere to go, and there's no zip in the tent, and all the energy that's happening on stage really hits them, and their emotion hits you while you're on stage. It's been a run and an experience that I'll never forget.
Wonderful.
And and especially with all of the touring that I've done, that I mentioned over these last several years, coming home to New York and picking up that show and doing it every 8 weeks, it's really changed my life.
Wonderful.
And 20 years from now, if you and I were to do this interview, I'd be able to tell that story and still tell you that really it changed my life doing
Wonderful.
that show.
Now, that's just it as far as it's the intimacy level. I mean, oftentimes, yes, you can go ahead and play Madison Square Garden to 20,000 people, or you can play to 20 people and get a total different perspective. And I like what you said there as far as that goes. Whether you play for one person or you play for 100,000 people, the show must go on, and you have to bring that same level. You don't play down, you play to that level, and I really commend you for that. That's really, really cool. I like the story. Thanks for sharing that.
It's harder to play for, at least in my experience, it's much harder to play for 75 people than 7,500 because there's nowhere to hide. With 7,500, as crazy as it sounds, you actually have a lot. There's the 7,500 really just turns into one gigantic amoeba.
Yeah, exactly.
And you feel kind of safe. Whereas with 75 people, it's a bit of a high wire act, and it's a bit of a high wire act emotionally on stage too.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very well put too. Before we wrap things up on the podcast today, let's get a rundown of all of your social medias and of course the label website. Can you give us that first, and then all your socials? Yeah,
ECRmusicgroup.com is the label and all the artists and everything that we're doing. And then if you want to find me on the socials, I'm at the Blake Morgan on all of them. All so you can just go to at the Blake Morgan.
Those will be found in the show notes, so if you're driving in your car right now, don't get into an accident. We'll include those a little bit later. You can get them when you pull over. We're going to wrap up the show with the title cut from Violent Delights. How did this song become the title cut, and did you come up with the music first or the lyrics? Or I always kind of wonder about song titles and such. How does that all happen?
Yeah, so I'm a melody first person for the most part, but I kind of have a tranche of lyrical ideas and titles, and then I have the tranche of like melodies and musical ideas or riffs. And a lot of times I'll end up marrying them with each other. The title of this song and why it's the title track of the record, and in fact why the record is called Violent Delights itself, is it's from Romeo and Juliet. It's from a line in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. And I say William Shakespeare because after a show, and this can fit into your touring thing, actually, because I didn't give you a touring thing, but after a show in Portland, Oregon, someone said, "Violent Delights, is that Shakespeare?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "William Shakespeare?" And I said, "No, Steve Shakespeare."
Bill Shakespeare, yeah.
Yes, it's William Shakespeare. But it's a line in Romeo and Juliet when the kids have run away because their families hate each other, and they're trying to get married in secret, and they go to a friar and they beg him to marry them. And the friar basically says, "Kids, I think this is a really bad idea. I'll do it, but I think this is a really bad idea, and I think this is going to wind up being big trouble for you." And of course it does wind up being big trouble for them because they die. And I'm sorry for spoiling the end of Romeo and Juliet to any of your listeners, but the play has been out for 400 years, so you've had your chance.
Yeah.
But what the friar actually says is he says, "I know that the passion that you feel right now feels like everything, but you should be careful because you're playing with fire." But the way he says it, fortunately, written by Bill Shakespeare, is a little bit more artful than what I just said. The friar says, "These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die like fire."
Wow.
And that's where the title of the record comes from.
Very good. Well put. I like that. Thanks for quoting Bill Shakespeare, too, by the way. It's been a treat to have you on the show as we're going to wrap it up with the title cut with Violent Delights. Blake, it's been great to have you on the show, man. I thank you so much for taking the time. You're a busy man. You do so many things and wear so many hats. But I thank you for being a member of our new growing family on the Someone You Should Know podcast.
You are a pro, and this was great. You did a great job. I'm really happy to have been on the show.
Hi, this is Rick Anthony, thanking you again for listening to this episode of Someone You Should Know. Now, if you're an aspiring musician or an established musician that's looking for a little exposure, I invite you to drop us a line at someoneyoushouldknowpodcast@gmail.com. That's someoneyoushouldknowpodcast@gmail.com. Also, I invite you to tell a friend about the Someone You Should Know podcast. I thank you for tuning in this time, and I invite you to check us out next time on the Someone You Should Know podcast, because you never know who's going to show up. Until next time, remember, God loves you, and so do I.